This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by University of California Press, publishers of the book Will Work for Food by Laura Ann Minkoff-Zern and Teresa M. Mares. Consumers are demanding a healthier and more sustainable food system. Yet labor is rarely part of the discussion. This book chronicles the essential role and exploitation of frontline workers across the food chain, connecting the entire food system from fields to stores, restaurants, home kitchens, and even garbage dumps. Learn more about Will Work for Food at ucpress.edu. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Welcome to the resistance. During the first Trump administration, socialists loved to invoke this as a joke. The liberal resistance, we charged, was interested in performative displays of opposition, blaming Russia for everything, naively hoping Democratic Party adults in the room would take charge and turn back the clock to pre-2016 business as usual. Everything, though, has changed pretty dramatically over the months since Trump took office again. Much of the liberal base is in open revolt against a leadership that has so clearly failed to stop the inexorable march of far-right politics. Liberals are voting for Zohran, shifting left on Palestine, increasingly favorable to socialism as the solution to the problem of MAGA. That's what I'm discussing today with labor and NYC DSA activist Eric Blanc, Indivisible co-executive director Leah Greenberg, and left progressive political strategist Waleed Shahid. Before we get rolling, this podcast is listener supported, and the place where listeners support us is at patreon.com/thedig. We do get support from some advertisers of books and whatnot, stuff that we like and think you might like, but we do not sell advertising space for mattresses or website services, even though that would make us a bunch of money. It would just sound and feel weird. We also do not paywall any episodes for Patreon supporters. That would also make us a ton more money. We are fundamentally a political education project, and so we put every episode out there free of charge for everyone to listen to. And the only reason we can do that is because listeners like you make a voluntary monthly or annual contribution. We also have gifts, including some great new t-shirts and hats. Please contribute now. That's patreon.com/thedig. One last thing before we get started. We heard about our comrade Asad Haider's tragic death just a few days ago before recording this introduction. Asad was a friend to a lot of friends of this pod, and he came on in 2018 to discuss his book, Mistaken Identity, which really did so much to cut through a lot of noise at a very loud moment of those debates. Sending my best to Asad's friend and family and posting a link to my 2018 interview with him in the show notes. Okay, here's Eric Blanc, Leah Greenberg, and Waleed Shahid. Eric Blanc is a labor and NYC DSA activist, a professor of labor studies at Rutgers University, and author of the recent book, We Are the Union. He writes at the Substack laborpolitics.com. Leah Greenberg is a co-founder and co-executive director of Indivisible, where she supports a grassroots movement of thousands of local Indivisible groups across the country. Before co-founding Indivisible, she worked as a staffer for Congressman Tom Perriello and at the State Department. Waleed Shahid is executive director of The Block and a political strategist who advised campaigns like Uncommitted and the Green New Deal. A former spokesperson for Justice Democrats, he's worked with the candidacies of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jamal Bowman, and Summer Lee, and serves on the editorial board of The Nation. Eric Blanc, Leah Greenberg, and Waleed Shahid. Welcome to The Dig.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for having us on.
Great to be here.
The socialist and populist left has been trying to move this project, we could say since 2016. We could date it back to Occupy as well, but really coherently since Bernie first ran. We made some significant headway that year and then again in 2020. And there were tons of other victories along the way. But obviously in politics, the point is to win and then to govern and transform society. And by that measure, we were coming up really short. And thinking back specifically to 2020, but really the entirety of the past decade, a big part of what the socialist left has been trying to do, I think, is to make the case to the liberal Democratic base, the base of the Democratic Party, that the only way to address the root causes of MAGA and of Trump is by confronting neoliberalism and the forever wars and by overthrowing the Democratic establishment. That was breaking through somewhat, but not enough to win. And what seems really significant right now is that these politics are breaking through, it seems, in a really powerful way that we can see from Zohran's coalition to the anti-oligarchy tour to the broad front in the streets confronting ICE. How did the liberal base, which had, I think, placed their faith in the Democratic establishment to protect them from Trump, become so radicalized over the last 11, 12 months by him being elected again? Leah.
I don't think you can separate the reaction that the liberal base has had in this moment from the broader societal dynamics that we have been seeing unfold. In Trump 1.0, there was at least a pretty solid pretense by corporate actors, by a lot of different institutions across society that they were attempting to uphold some set of things around the norms of liberal democracy, protect some set of vulnerable populations, et cetera, et cetera. I think we can all be really clear that was not out of the goodness of their hearts, but it did create a pretty significant contrast. And what we've seen this time around is just a total elite and institutional collapse in the face of Trumpism, starting basically immediately after he was elected. And so I think for folks who believed what Democratic leadership were telling them, that this was oncoming fascism, that it was going to be a direct personal threat to them and their communities and their neighbors, to watch this combination of Democratic leadership, fecklessness, going quiet, to the extent that they were having really internal circular arguments about blaming the groups instead of any kind of meaningful accounting about what had happened. And then simultaneously watching a bunch of other institutions across society, everybody from Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg to Target and basically every corporation you could name immediately rushed to bend the knee. It created a much more clear illustration that the project to consolidate MAGA political power and the project to consolidate corporate power were one and the same. And I think that set the stage for a lot of what has unfolded since.
Yeah. Waleed.
I think also, and this is a point that I think was really honed for me by a guest of this podcast, Leah Greenberg, who told me that some of the frontal attack by Donald Trump and his administration is primarily on like many of the institutions that the liberal base belongs to. So if you look at universities, law firms, federal government, media, and employees of like institutions affected by big tech consolidation, like there's a tangible difference between 2017 and 2025 in terms of the kinds of upper middle class or middle class white collar workers that are probably ideologically or affectively liberal, but are really being squeezed by this administration and being attacked by this administration, just in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of policy. And so, JD Vance and Donald Trump and Elon Musk really hates this kind of liberal class. They have fan fiction of replacing the liberal class with robots and AI. And I just think that, like, to, emphasize Leah's point prior, there's a way in which that class is being squeezed, and the party and the elected representatives who are supposed to represent that class not really having the fight in them to represent that in a big way, and actually like being part of a general kind of capitulation to authoritarianism and fascism.
Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, so I agree with Leah that, the main thing is that not only is Trump way worse this time, but the institutions are fighting way less. And so that contradiction is just like a deeply radicalizing dynamic. It does, I think, predate the election, though. I think, for instance, the inability of the Democratic Party establishment to like push out Biden and the whole age debacle, which we've sort of forgotten all about, really did expose to a lot of the liberal base that, contrary to the rhetoric, the motivations of the people on top seem to be much more about ego and career than it is about fighting fascism or the country. And so I think that that really was a very eye-opening experience. And then there's just a general dynamic where, because the authoritarian drive of this new administration is so deep, liberals, for positive and maybe, limited reasons as well, really feel the attack on democracy as like core to their politics in a way that maybe other segments of the population don't to the same extent. So there's just radicalizing in response to events in a way that, if you don't actually think that the system was working as well as many leftists or many like non-college educated workers do, maybe even the attacks on democracy aren't as forefront in your mind. But if you really do believe, and I think liberals are right to believe in the importance of defending liberal democracy, then it seems like an all hands on deck moment to them, more, I think, than any other part of the population.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that to the extent that we draw a lot of our leaders and a lot of our organizing from folks who they didn't start with perhaps a ton of faith in the system, but they had enough faith that what they see happening represents a radical rupture, right? Which is different than some populations of folks who don't experience this moment as a rupture so much as a continuation and a worsening. I think there are a lot of people who go from 0 to 60 in a moment like that, primarily out of a sense of this is an all hands on deck. We have to respond to the threat moment. And I think the fact that they did not see their elected leadership moving in the same direction at the same time opened up an experience and a rupture that has not healed.
Joshua Cohen, who blogs and tweets at Edingermentum, had an interesting post recently where he described the liberal revolt against the Democratic Party establishment as a relatively autonomous revolt, that the organized socialist left is in a good position to channel, organize with, and help lead, but does not and maybe cannot actually control. What do you make of this argument, and what are its implications for how the socialist left should think about building bridges with this liberal insurgency?
Two of the main mass mobilizations that have, I think, been successful in the past year have been the Tesla takedown protests and No Kings, which to me are two different iterations of, what maybe is called the autonomous liberal revolt. And one a bit more like, one less institutionalized, and one obviously coming from organizations like Indivisible and Move On and others. But yeah, I think that these efforts people are looking to express their anger and frustration and like want to be able to do it in a way that feels like not necessarily like ideological or even socialist, but a part of a fight against Donald Trump and fascists and fascism. And I think that the third most successful like mobilization was that had like national impact was Zohran's election. And I think there's a way in which where the rubber meets the road is obviously in elections, because there's very few places where people who are socialists or even social democrats can win an election with just people who identify with those terms. You have to build a coalition across ideology and across demographics. And I think that often the people, some of the more younger populist socialist candidates can embody that fight against authoritarianism much better than the Democratic establishment.
I would say I think that, pulling from that argument around why there's this crisis of faith right now, the fundamental proposition of Biden 2020 was that Trumpism was a temporary insanity that could be fixed by electing the most run-of-the-mill, most persuasive candidate. And, you'd get him in, the adults would be back in charge. things would be okay, this fever would break. That was the promise. And a lot of people went for it, or, grudgingly went for it. And so I think the basic issue that is happening right now is that there is no follow-on proposition or no follow-on promise from Democratic elected leadership that explains at this moment, right? It's clearly not a temporary fever. MAGA is a force in American politics, and it is going to be a force for an extended period of time. How do you actually fundamentally get out of this situation where every 4 years, every election is a referendum on democracy, is a threat of authoritarian consolidation? I don't think Democratic leadership has offered a meaningful theory that replaces the "this is a temporary fever" framing. And I think that whoever is able to successfully make a convincing proposition about this is actually how we shift our politics in a direction that doesn't involve constant confrontations with the worst 30% of American society, I think that's going to be the way that you break through.
What I'd add to that is that this is in many ways a surprising dynamic for the left, which is to say, what I would add is that the liberal vote is in many ways a surprising development for the socialist left. I don't think that people were exactly prepared to see not just a repeat of Resistance 1.0, and it's part of the reason we're having this conversation today. There has been a shift towards trying to make sense of it, but I think we probably have to go further to be really concrete. For instance, DSA only just recently joined the No Kings coalition, and I think that's a good sign that people are trying to figure out how we work with this sort of broader liberal resistance movement. But there was also a tendency sometimes to be a little bit, maybe if some sectors of the left to be a little condescending towards the No Kings protest, for instance. So when we're thinking about how we relate to the liberal sort of resistance, I think this is a good thing to keep in mind, is that our major task right now isn't only to differentiate ourselves from liberals, and not, especially not like liberals who are out there fighting, but to engage with them and to be like the best builders for No Kings rallies, and to be there talking to folks about how they can plug in for the long time organizing. And a lot of the critiques, I would say, are, have some truth to them. But if we're looking at it as organizers and not just sort of like online posters, then the question becomes really, how do we engage in a productive way with this really widespread movement? And we're only really just now getting our sort of feet wet in how to do that in a meaningful way on the ground.
One other thing I just add is to the kind of lineage of, or the trajectory of Democratic Party liberalism, like warning liberals about, Democratic Party establishment warning liberals about the threat of fascism, is kind of where immigration becomes a huge issue in the story, where, contrary to popular belief, white liberals tend to be, a very big demographic in favor of immigrant rights in this country. And the fact that once Donald Trump defeats Kamala Harris, there's such a big backlash from the Democratic Party establishment and pundit class about Democrats going too far on immigration, too far left on immigration, while like they had spent the past year warning Democrats about how Donald Trump was going to wreak havoc on immigrant communities. Just this past week, from like the right wing and left wing of Democratic Party liberalism, both David Brooks and Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times had like columns about, Michelle Goldberg had a column about like immigrant rights groups you should donate to for the holidays. David Brooks had a column about a church in Connecticut that's, helping undocumented immigrants and people seeking asylum from like combating ICE. And the whole kind of trajectory in which the party warned this class of people to really worry about immigrants and what Donald Trump would do to them, and then told them to basically, well, maybe don't, like, there's a kind of like position of nowhere where it's very contradictory. Yeah, they become, back to Leah's point, like just really self-interested and self-involved, that they change their arguments to preserve their own hides every time. I think that now, because the elected officials aren't leading the fight on immigration as much, that creates such a huge opening for this class of people who really care about inclusion and pluralism and protecting the vulnerable to have kind of autonomous ways of engaging that are filling a vacuum that isn't being provided by the leadership class of their party.
If I may offer the reverse mirror image of that, I think the two early signs of the disjuncture between the base and elected leadership were HR 9495, the nonprofit killer bill, which they tried to move in a bipartisan fashion immediately after the election, and then the Laken-Riley Act in January. And a very firm memory I have is trying to communicate to Democratic electeds that our base was genuinely alarmed and upset and did not understand in any way why we would be offering Donald Trump more powers around enforcement on nonprofits, more powers to go after immigrants, and consolidate a secure police force, and getting somewhere between dismissal and contempt in reaction, right? And people saying, not only just do we disagree, but we disagree, and this is why we lost the election. And, your base is just a total disinterest in engaging with the question at all. And then by mid-February, when the calls and the volume and the anger was boiling over, having a lot of those people be like, why is everyone so mad? And, our reaction was, we've been telling you this has been building. There's actually just a consistent gap between the communications you've made to people about what you care about and the things you're doing, and that's coming back to attack you now.
Leah, many have remarked that for the liberal base, it's not so much left versus center so much as fighters versus folders. But are these two things, leftists, socialists versus fighters, are they increasingly, if not, of course, always becoming one and the same? Because I think this is an important thing to think about, because then it's not just for socialists a question of coalition with liberals per se, but also just being welcoming. If a lot of people on the liberal base, as polls suggest, are becoming friendly to socialism and even beginning to identify as socialists.
Well, I would describe it as an x-axis and a y-axis around, how far to the left your politics are and how much you think this moment is an emergency that requires using all the tools in the toolbox and that ultimately requires structural reforms that meaningfully address the roots of the crisis, right? And what I would say with our folks is that people identify in a lot of different places on the kind of the x-axis of left to center left, but are all at really, really high levels on this is an emergency requiring everything that we have. And there tends to be a lot of correlation in, people who are in now I'm going to get confused and I don't know how to use X and Y axes, but there are a lot of people who are both on the kind of like to the left and this is an emergency axis. And, and there's a lot of overlap in what's required, right? When we talk about structural reforms at this point, it's not just that what we were talking about in 2021. It's not just the For the People Act. It's not just, it is the Voting Rights Act, but it is Voting Rights Plus. It's actually, what are we going to do about the Supreme Court? What are we going to do about the two-party system in this country that keeps creating these conflicts? What are we going to do about corporate power and the consolidation of corporate power that has allowed big tech fascists to operate as a backstop to this administration? I think there's a lot of overlap when you talk about what is the ultimate set of solutions to the moment that we are in that would allow us to meaningfully create a country where people belong and are dignified and have a voice. And so I think I'm not sure I would focus on the labels per se, but I do think that when you're actually talking about what gets us to the other side of this and what gets us to a genuine improvement in people's lives, there's a lot of potential for overlap.
It's not just liberals who've changed since the first Trump administration, as a number of people have commented already. The socialist left is in a pretty different situation too. In the years following the 2016 election, many on the left rejected or were at least skeptical and suspicious of a lot of aspects of the liberal resistance. It was a politics that for many on the socialist left, myself sometimes included, saw this resistance politics as framing Trump's election as kind of neatly the product of Russian interference and wanting to just turn back the clock to the pre-Trump U.S. politics as usual. As Leah mentioned, the fever will break once the adults are back in the room. And at the same time, there was relatedly this intense debate within the socialist left as to whether Trump's project was fascist. Everyone on the left opposed Trump, but there was a really sometimes interesting, sometimes arcane debate over whether fascist was the right concept. But now everyone on the online left loves Jennifer Welch and agrees that Trump's project is fascist. While there are some on the left who might still feel, on the socialist left, have some reservations about the resistance, I think increasingly the majority agree that we should definitely be linking arms and joining in. Eric, how would you describe that trajectory on the socialist left and sort of the politics internal to the socialist left on how to relate to the liberal resistance?
The first thing I would say is that it's just a game changer, as we've been already talking about, that the liberal resistance this time around is very explicitly being pitted against the democratic establishment. And so if there's one thing socialists like to do, it's to fight the Democratic Party establishment. So there's just an obvious affinity there, which explains a lot of the sort of more openness to engaging. There's also, I think, just a question of urgency. A lot of the left last time around, I would say myself included, had, I think, a somewhat valid take that the Trump administration wasn't as much of a radical departure from sort of republicanism and right-wing politics, and as maybe liberals suggested. And if anything, there's a lot of debate, and maybe we downplayed the threat even this time around. I would say, just like fess up, I didn't think Trump this time around was going to be as bad as he's been. And I think a lot of us underestimated that. And then there's an immediate thing, not just in abstract, but like, what does it mean that speaking from personal experience, like I'm a leftist, I really have, for the first time in my life, had to consider what's going to happen if I lose my job for speaking out. There's an urgency, and I'm coming from a place of relative privilege. I have a union job. I'm teaching at a public university, but I think there is an extent to which just the intensity of the authoritarian attack across the board has led to a feeling amongst the left that it is all hands on deck, to an extent that didn't feel as much the case last time around. So the question now is, what do you do with that? There's an openness, but I actually feel like the muscle memory and what the left knows how to do really well is fight the Democratic establishment. I don't think we have as much recent experience of what it looks like to work in coalition with liberals against the right wing. And it's not that anyone's opposed, but it actually requires just different things that we haven't really in recent period consistently done. And so the question of like really trying to scale up a broader fight is the task. And it does require, I think, continuing to make these cases that our main fight right now is with the right wing and not with sort of the liberal resistance.
One other thing is that, there's always, it's very rare, almost never happens, that a candidate on the left wins an election by being publicly known as a leftist, or like that the campaign is waged on those terms. And so there's like constant rebranding of what is the fight in the Democratic Party, rebranding that I've participated in between like old guard, new generation, change versus status quo, establishment, anti-establishment, fight versus capitulate, movement versus stale politics. And there's a way in which sometimes the like political weather is in the right direction, where liberals become the kind of place where you have to figure out which one of those you're going with, and that switch becomes really effective for elections. Another thing I think about is in 2020, the two congressional elections that were very much buoyed by the racial justice movement during the George Floyd protests were Jamal Bowman's election and Cori Bush's election. In that election, with Jamal Bowman, the New York Times had endorsed him in like another period where liberals on racial justice were moving toward pretty like major radical thinking about what it would look like to create racial justice in this country. The example I bring up is for Jamal Bowman. When the New York Times endorsed Jamal Bowman, his approvals in the polling that we saw amongst white college educated liberals, he went from like 17% to like 70 overnight once the Times endorsed him. In retrospect, like when you look at Zohran Mamdani being rejected by the New York Times several times by their editorial board, the New York Times told New York voters not to vote for him, and yet he still won, like gives me a sense that the gatekeepers of liberalism, particularly in the Times, like are becoming less and less salient between 2020 and 2025.
And his biggest neighborhoods were Brownstone, Brooklyn. Actually, his highest percentages were like Park Slope, Copple Hill, etc.
Yeah, and like I think some of the ways you can think about that is like the like over 45 expression of that is No Kings, and the under 45 expression of that is the anti-oligarchy tour by Bernie and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But maybe age is primarily the divider there because of different experiences of the financial crisis and politics since Obama. But the point I'm trying to make here is that liberals become a really important fulcrum in these kinds of forward movement backlash moments of a more progressive politics. And because in 2023 to 2024, I think we experienced a little bit of that backlash to Black Lives Matter in particular, and now we're experiencing a backlash to the backlash to the backlash, that there's a real opening here to combine kind of those two, the spirit of the anti-oligarchy tour and the spirit of the No Kings tour, No Kings marches.
Well, and I do think there's also an important kernel in there about the delinking of mainstream liberals' faith in mainstream media as well. One of the big shifts that we've seen is around, where people have confidence in to get their news and their analysis. And the reality is that, obviously the Washington Post is not where it was given the Bezos takeover, but even institutions like the New York Times, there's just a great deal more distrust in the role that the mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream media has played in
Hence the
Trump's
rise of
campaign
Jennifer
process.
Welch.
Hence the rise of Jennifer Welch. Absolutely.
Waleed, I want to get into that generational point you just made. I've been doing a lot of work in Rhode Island, building coalition with liberal resistance groups. I have two separate meetings this week with local resistance groups around the state to build for the 2026 primaries. One of them is an Indivisible chapter, Leah. And one thing that I found surprising since starting to do this work more intensively in recent months is that we all know that the crowd at protests like No Kings can be on the older end. But when I started to have conversations with a lot of these leaders, they were like, where are the young people? And I was very surprised because I think of it the opposite way, the other way around, that young people are extremely involved in groups like DSA, doing the encampments against the Gaza genocide, et cetera. And so there was this like total funhouse mirror situation where you had the older folks in the liberal resistance thinking that younger people are just totally demobilized in the face of the fascist threat. And I was like, who do you think organized the Zohran campaign in New York initially? And I don't know. It's there does seem to be this discussion that we're having about building socialist and left liberal coalitions seems to also be fundamentally a conversation about building intergenerational coalition. What does looking at it from that vantage point elucidate about the task at hand?
Yeah, it's really interesting phenomena that the No Kings protest tends to be like, multiple degrees, 60 and up. And while, my sense of the anti-oligarchy tour is that it's much younger. I don't know how race and gender like play into those two different things, but yeah, I think, the marriage of those two fights and the tension between them is the future of a kind of progressive realignment in the Democratic Party that, that in 2020 was obviously divided through an election that was not ranked choice voting, in which I would imagine many of the people who my assumption is that many of the people like powering the No Kings protest did not vote for Bernie Sanders, but maybe voted for Biden or Warren or Buttigieg. And, obviously the opposite with the anti-oligarchy tour, where I assume the vast majority of the people voted for Bernie Sanders in 2020. One interesting thing is that No Kings protest doesn't have like an elected leader who's the spokesperson and leader of that. And there's something really inspiring about that, about like a citizen generated endeavor that is, not carried through the star power of someone like AOC and Bernie. And at the same time, there's the policy or ideological components can be like a little like in the way that the No Kings protests and mobilizations might have an effect on 2026 primaries or 2028 primaries. It's a little bit less clear compared to the anti-oligarchy tour, where I think it's a little bit more clear of what that politics is. Yeah, I'm also like curious about both your experience, Leah, and your experience, Dan, of, there was so much discussion in the middle part of this year about a word we haven't used is main political philosophy that's been thrown out for the liberal wing of the Democratic Party has been abundance. And I feel like on the rank and file level of like people's the main thing driving their political expression in No King's resistance or No King's mobilization or Indivisible or Move On or that kind of wing of the party, it is not abundance that is the thing that's animating them. That's an assumption I have. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think there's a way in which the elite discourse amongst liberalism is not mapping onto the mass discourse of where people are like everyday, rank and file wine moms are at.
I want to turn this over to Leah in a second, but just one more anecdote from Rhode Island is what's been one really remarkable thing is that for the recent No Kings protest, there was a really breakthrough agreement to have a Palestinian speaker and have a whole kind of Palestinian liberation contingent in the No Kings protest. It was, I think, this was debated and decided amongst a motley crew of real grassroots liberal resistance organizers in Rhode Island. And there was some dissension, but they ultimately came to a solid decision to coalesce with specifically Jewish Voice for Peace. And that represents not just this breakthrough coalition over Palestine, breakthrough coalition between the socialist left and left liberal resistance, but again, it was also a fundamentally intergenerational coalition because it was much more gray-haired people sitting on one side and much more millennial and Zoomer on the other. And it's all very interesting. Leah?
Well, and I mean, I'll just quickly add, I think that mirrors a lot of where we've ended up in terms of kind of the national framing. In the first No Kings March in June, I marched next to Rua Roman of Georgia, who spoke as one of the speakers at the primary or at the national live stream. And we have tried to be really intentional about balancing the fact that, on the one hand, No Kings is not an entity that has a platform, right? It doesn't have a set of policy ideas that it's advancing. It is a broad front against authoritarianism, and also being really clear about inclusion of voices that recognize the Palestine movement. And so, there's a continued negotiation and there's a continued process of like building together at the local level that has been ongoing, and it's in different places, in different contexts. And also, I do really think that kind of like knitting together of the intergenerational context and kind of the broad front is really important. So there are so many different threads that I want to respond to here. First, in terms of the 2020 cycle, we had a really extended conversation with our leaders in 2020 around, were we going to endorse in a presidential cycle? Should we endorse? Who are we for? We have some data out of that suggests that the top candidate amongst our folks was Warren. Very strong. There was a strong but smaller Bernie faction. There were some folks who were kind of scattered around the different moderate candidates. Things, shaped up in the later stages pretty quickly in a way that limits our ability to say who went where as different candidates came in and dropped out. But the bigger dominant feeling for folks was that they didn't really think that a presidential endorsement was the top priority for locally based organizing hubs that often had, a very strong foot in a local race or a congressional race or a broader suite of activism that they couldn't disrupt in order to have some effect on the presidential. And that was where people ended pretty consistently. And we respected that very much as a national level after having that conversation. And so we have some sense of where people's optimal politics are. And also, people had a really different take on primaries overall as of the first Trump term than they do this time around. And so that's a little bit where people were, just practically speaking. On abundance, I think this has been one of the places where there is just a huge gap, Waleed, as you put it, between the conversation that is preoccupying kind of elite commentators and the conversation that is happening amongst grassroots activists and kind of rank and file folks, right? Because fundamentally, immediately after the election, I think there's this very confusing moment where Abundance, which is kind of a book that was intended for a Kamala Harris term or a second Biden term in many ways, gets kind of rebranded as an answer to why we lost and gets sucked into this super toxic discourse, I would say, around kind of recriminations post 2024 and this extended set of arguments and discussions around kind of remaking the party and, married to a set of moderate causes and factions. I can't stress enough how much none of that was of interest to people who were freaking out about fascism. Which I think is actually like unfortunate in a lot of ways, right? As somebody who has got a lot of enthusiasm for UMB politics myself, I think that conflation set the stage for a number of things that were not super healthy. And Waleed, I think you've done a lot of work trying to untangle those currents and appreciate that. But the functional impact was that I think a lot of people who might well have been open to various parts of that argument mostly perceived it as kind of irrelevant to the main questions of the day, which were, what are we actually going to do to protect fundamental rights, to fight back against this massive onslaught? Who's actually in that fight, and who is spending all of their time thinking about what leverage we have and how do we use it?
I'd add a few things. First is the depth of youth radicalization that's continued really puts a lie to one of the major talking points that happened after Trump's reelection 2024, which you might remember when there was this move from the establishment to like fight against the groups and to say we need to pivot to the center, drop fighting for immigrants and trans people. Part of the argument was, look, young people are making this dramatic shift to the center if we don't meet them.
As part of a vibe shift.
Yeah, it's a vibe shift. And I was always really skeptical of that. I didn't think it was in the data. There was like marginal thing with young men. And it seemed like a lot of the youth vote was over economic anxiety. And we should just say that the experience of the last year decisively proves that, contrary to that claim, young people remain very consistently on the left. And if anything, I do think there's, of the radical activist young left, which I'm pretty deeply involved with, I think there is actually still, or was, somewhat of a hesitancy to go all in on the fight against authoritarianism. And I think part of that has to do with Palestine, and it's worth flagging, because it's true that we're coming together more with liberal, but there was also an experience that so many young people had of going to encampments and feeling like big liberal institutions essentially were screwing them over. So you think about like university elites, but then also a lot of the punditry.
The New York Times.
What's that? New York Times. And so there's a real polarization, and I think there was also maybe a skepticism of some liberals for not foregrounding more the fight against the genocide. And so I think actually we're still living a little bit in the shadow of that, and it hasn't been fully overcome. And then the other thing I would add is that the Fighting Oligarchy tour and Zohran, these again were not exclusively or only about fighting authoritarianism. It had this combination of kind of a radical economic approach. I think that the place above all where we can reconnect the radical young activist left with liberals is on fighting ICE. This is one thing that really brings everybody together, that there's a real deep revulsion amongst both of these wings at what the Trump administration doing against our like undocumented friends and family and neighbors. And that is a place I would hope that we can in the immediate really scale up far more young and older and more politically left and more politically liberal wings to fight back together. And there's a lot of openings there.
One big shift that I've noticed, and Eric, we'll definitely return to the Palestine politics later, but one big shift between the first and second Trump administrations that I've noticed generally and specifically in terms of ordinary members of the liberal resistance is a stronger emphasis on fighting the Trump regime rather than derogatorily speaking about or demonizing ordinary Trump voters. And notably, Zohran launched his campaign by standing on a street corner and asking people why they'd given up on Democrats and why they'd voted for Trump. And he went on about a year later to win those neighborhoods back. And Leah, you've touched on this. We've all touched on this a bit here and there throughout this interview, but we're seeing this, I think, really powerfully right now through the anti-oligarchy framing, which was first put forward by Bernie and then AOC in these rallies, and has just sort of become, I think, the dominant left and liberal way to interpret what's happening right now. And what it's doing, I think, very powerfully is connecting the dots between economic and political authoritarianism. But that really wasn't part of the mainstream discussion or liberal resistance discourse during Trump 1.0. What is it about the conditions of Trump's second administration that have allowed for this anti-oligarchy framework to become perhaps the dominant one? And what sort of political work does that framing do?
I think there are two pieces. I think first the mask is fully off, right? You have a bunch of corporations that had a frame around corporate social responsibility, a frame around, for example, doing meaningful work to protect the 2020 election from sabotage. If you go and you look at the list of corporations that tried to donate to protect that election compared to like who has donated to the Trump ballroom, et cetera, et cetera. I think the degree to which corporations have been very visibly avid and enthusiastic collaborators within the Trump and MAGA agenda, the degree to which even the corporations that people ostensibly think of as, quote unquote, good corporate citizens have behaved as have obeyed in advance, have gotten rid of their DEI policies, have trashed their climate policies, have donated to the Trump ballroom or to the inauguration. There is no meaningful, credible argument that delinks the consolidation of corporate power in this country from the consolidation of right-wing, white Christian nationalist power. And I think that is a revealing, it's a reaction. And then the other thing is that there was no meaningful democratic leadership interpretation of what was happening in the first 4 months. And there was this powerful Fight the Oligarchy tour with Bernie and AOC making a really clear connection between what was happening on the corporate power side and what was happening in Washington. And I think the fact that the act of stepping into that leadership vacuum was really important for actually linking those two things together. Now, I think that there's sometimes a little bit of framing that suggests that, there's a lot of daylight between a no kings and a no oligarchs frame. I think that that's not particularly valid on the ground. I think what we've experienced is that there's a lot of openness to an overarching story about corporate power. Bernie spoke at our most recent No Kings in Washington. He was the headliner. We do see people really making those connections. We see a lot of enthusiasm amongst our own folks for corporate campaigns, for theories of how do you actually dissuade this kind of corporate collaboration and enablement. And I think there's like a lot to build on there.
Yeah, I think we can't overstate the role played by the world's richest man becoming just like a freakish fascism accelerationist in the powerful Doge way that he did in really waking people up to the connections between economic and political structures.
100%.
Well, also, I imagine like one of the most foremost intellectual leaders of the liberal resistance is Erica Chenoweth, who's like a scholar of anti-authoritarianism and resistance against dictators across the world. And, they are someone who is not like very Pollyannish about the kind of economic leverage needed to, get rid of authoritarians and dictators. And a lot of their work revolves around things like boycott, strikes, non-cooperation. And that's a lot of after Trump was elected, Erica did like a whole tour amongst with liberal media about their research. And I think that, if you're a liberal or someone who participates in the No Kings March, that is another place of synergy where the intellectual you're reading is saying, well, you need to figure out a way to generate economic leverage and create consequences on the regime for their actions, whether it's lowering their public opinion or creating breaking apart their coalition or creating resignations or these kinds of things. And I think that's a kind of form of politics that is much more common in other parts of the world and less common, here. Maybe Eric can say more about that than I can, related to, what the place of labor unions and anti-authoritarian struggles abroad versus here. But I do think that's another place of synergy between, someone like Erica, I think swaddles both worlds of the kinds of political power needed to rid ourselves of this regime.
I want to talk a little bit more about what you mentioned a bit in passing, Dan, which is why there's significantly less blaming and focus on Trump supporters than there was last time around. I think part of that is there was an open acknowledgement, I think, from all parts of the left and the center that the Democratic Party is losing working people. that wasn't exactly as prevalent last time around. There was some talk about the white working class, but this time around, from above, you have the Democratic Party, the establishment sort of blaming the groups and woke for why we're losing workers. And then on the left, there's a strong case that essentially was economic anxiety. And the fact that Trump did so much better than last time around amongst Latinos and to a certain extent amongst Black voters, I think undercut an assumption that some people had under the first Trump administration, that racism was like a sufficient explanation for what was going on. And so from the second you have to start talking about losing the working class, of all backgrounds and economic anxieties, this just has a really different valence for how liberals and the left look at who voted for Trump and how we relate to the moment we're in. And I think it's really positive to a certain extent that people are talking so much more about the working class and economic anxiety. The answers we give are really different than the Democratic Party establishment, and certainly from MAGA. But the fact that there is this sort of talking about class is new. I don't think that was the same case, in 2016, or certainly not before that.
Yeah, not to be too much of a partisan socialist here, but I do recall in the first years of the first Trump administration, intense hostility from many liberal commentators when people on the left tried to contextualize, myself included, Trump's rise in economic misery, anxiety, contradiction, not just in terms of working class people being disaffected with the Democratic Party, but in terms of the economic system that we have creating a class of McMansion dwelling small businessmen that are fascists, the economics playing out in all of these different ways to undermine the Democratic coalition and build the MAGA coalition. There was a intense hostility from many liberal commentators to discussing that as all, and simply saying, basically, I think far more comforting for some people, this is the, eternally racist soul of working class white America reasserting itself.
The other thing I would add is I just wouldn't underestimate the psychological impact and what it sets in motion to win the popular vote versus losing the popular vote, right? In the first Trump term, I think a lurking assumption underlying a bunch of the strategy was this guy got elected by fluke. It's a quirk of the political system that we have, that he has been able to take office, and our job is to create as much visible opposition so that people who might go along with this agenda understand upfront that they're going to face electoral consequences for it on the back end. And the second term, if you lose the popular vote, by definition, you're going to need more people the next time around. And so the first strategic imperative is to drive down that popularity and win more people over, and then start to create the sense that there are going to be consequences for enablers. And that, I think, is the arc that we saw this year.
I also think, I want to go back to the 2020 data that Leah mentioned, where it just shows a deep divide between the kind of liberal commentariat and the liberal rank and file, and then a distinguishing between partisan Democrats in the coalition versus partisan liberals in the coalition, where Leah had mentioned that in the data they have about where her base was in 2020, the plurality of people were with Elizabeth Warren, who I think fits within the anti-oligarchy politics. The plurality of Indivisible's base was not Biden voters, and in the primary at least. And so I just think that's maps onto kind of the Zohran, Bradlander, Andrew Cuomo electorate, where I know we might talk about this later about there's another constituency of people who are older, more tend to be more diverse, who are much more attached to partisan Democrat language and framing than what I imagine is true of Indivisible's base, which is an important thing to point out here. And then that also shows the divide between the liberal intelligentsia and commentariat versus the liberal rank and file.
Let's tease that point out a little, Waleed, because the militancy of the proverbial liberal wine mom has become iconic, ubiquitous, celebrated point of reference for us on the left in the last 10, 11 months, exemplified again most powerfully by the wonderful Jennifer Welch. But it points to this question of who we're talking to and who we're talking about and who we're not talking about when we talk about the liberal resistance. So to break this out into two parts, first, who are the wine moms? Exactly what do we mean when we invoke them? Are they the latest iteration of suburban soccer moms? Do we mean something else by that? Do we mean contradictory and inchoate things by that? And then to get to that point you just made, Waleed, where do other key segments of the Democratic Party coalition, Black people, Latinos, Muslims, where do they fit into the emerging political conjuncture? Not to suggest that these are neat categories either, but
Bros, you forgot bros.
what about bros?
It's the year of the bro.
That's what socialists are bringing to the table. It does recall that amazing video from Zohran's election night. I don't know if you saw, when it was Mehdi Hassan, Jamal Bowman, Hassan Piker, and Prem Thacker like broing out on camera at the victory party. And Mike Cernovich had a meltdown about the intense virile masculinity that the socialist left was putting forward.
I know that's what they wanted.
Sorry.
In primary elections, there tends, when you look at polling and like people are trying to campaign out their path to 50%, the way that's often divided out is there's like white, college educated, self-identifying liberals over the age of 45 versus under the age of 45. And then there's often like Black voters and Latino voters are split out as separate demographics from that group of people. And what I've noticed is like we're kind of doing category elision here, where I do think there's a difference between the voters who it can be described as Biden, Warren, and Bernie. It could also be described as Cuomo, Brad Lander, and Zohran Mamdani, but that difference is significant. And, in the Biden camp, there's a lot of pride amongst that crew of people of the New York Times 2020 endorsement process, where Biden was flatly rejected by the New York Times editorial board. And then there was that viral video of Biden talking to a Black worker at the New York Times, I think a security guard who was in the elevator and said she was voting for him. And I think we should, both liberals and progressives and socialists, like we shouldn't delude ourselves with the fact that that demographic is a huge part of primary elections and the Democratic Party coalition and the anti-authoritarian coalition that is happening. Its politics are happening one foot in the things we're talking about and one foot out. There's a really big Target boycott being led right now by many Black churches. And so there is like anti-authoritarian and anti-oligarchy activity happening. And I still think that, my sense of that demographic is twofold, which is one, we had the largest civil rights protests in this country's history since the 1960s. In 2020, that didn't result in very much, like legislatively. And, maybe the system is really broken, and I'm kind of gonna check out of this, all this kind of activity happening now, because when it comes to racial justice, like the country is very schizophrenic. And there's like a second kind of feeling where I think the idea of competence, leadership you're familiar with, Democratic Party brand loyalty, names you're familiar with, like Joe Biden being Obama's vice president was huge in that election, Andrew Cuomo being Mario Cuomo's son and a governor for 3 terms, also really significant. There's like kind of two things happening with particularly, I think, Black voters in the Democratic coalition that is unique and pretty distinct from, I think, both the kind of young socialist crowd and the older No Kings crowd.
That's all so interesting. And one quick thing that I'll add before we hear from the rest of you is that on the one hand, we have clearly seen Black voter consolidation around what we might call the Democratic establishment pretty powerfully in multiple cases over the last decade. And yet, when you introduce generational analysis to that, it really gets a lot more complicated with the data, and I can't find the exact data points right now, but Zohran winning Black and Latino young people by much higher, by far more than he won young white people in New York City.
And flooding the election with turnout from those demographics. That was historic.
Yeah, Eric.
I have those numbers as 86% of young Latinos voted for Zohran, 84% of young Black people voted for Zohran, and then white young people were something more like 65%. So it really shows you how much of an age cleavage there is, and actually how much potential that I think is mostly still untapped for reaching into much broader segments of the working class than we currently have via the generational route. To me, that is really the next sort of frontier where we can build out more left base, certainly.
I'm Sam Adler-Bell, and you're listening to The Dig, by far my favorite podcast for sophisticated, lucid, and very, very, very thorough conversations about the past, present, and future of left politics. Personally, I would be completely lost and adrift without it, so please support the show at patreon.com/thedig.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Learning to Live in the Dark, Essays in a Time of Catastrophe by Wen Stevenson. After decades of failed international efforts to avoid climate disaster, the geophysical forces unleashed by global heating have converged with forms of political nihilism not seen since the rise of fascism in the 20th century. Faced with the resulting intellectual, moral, and spiritual abyss, and without a viable revolutionary left politics on the horizon, Stevenson poses a pertinent question on the left today. What does a life of radical commitment look like in the shadow of catastrophes that will not wait? Learning to Live in the Dark answers not with fatalism or any cheap hope, but with something sturdier, a resolve and solidarity as real as the dark itself. Visit haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Leah, you mentioned earlier a shift on the liberal resistance base in terms of interest in primarying establishment Democrats. We, of course, saw this broad left liberal coalition unite behind Zohran in New York, and it seems like we're seeing something similar in Maine. To what extent is the liberal resistance converging with DSA and Justice Democrats' strategy in terms of prioritizing primaries against establishment Democrats?
Well, I think we're watching it unfold right now, and we're trying to get more information. But what I can say is that the overall orientation that people are starting from is categorically different than it was at this time around in the 2018 cycle. I think people have a much clearer understanding that there is a very direct relationship between the frustrations that they have with overall Democratic Party leadership and the need to get involved in the primary and the candidate cycle. I think there is a much stronger sense that there are a lot of people in Democratic leadership or in Democratic establishment who are simply not up to the job, whether it is because they are of a generation that is simply not grappling with the challenges, or whether it is because they are corporate Democrats who are institutionally incapable of taking on the challenges that we have right now. We're seeing a ton of focus on money in politics, on crypto, on APAC money, on corporate money in general. We're seeing a ton of focus on, are people compelling fighters who are capable of making the case about what they are doing, not only who are capable of using their leverage, but who are actually also public communicators who are able to tell the story of what is happening. A lot of enthusiasm amongst our folks for folks like Chris Van Hollen, who was nobody's idea of kind of a breakout star last year, but who has done a combination of compelling public communications and genuinely meaningful actions that demonstrate how you use your leverage as a senator. And so, I think we're going to see how it unfolds. But what we're hearing from folks is just a totally different level of interest and engagement already, with a combination of getting involved in open seats and with taking some real direct action in relation to folks who are simply not living up to the job.
Yeah, if you look at the net favorability amongst Democratic voters in New York between AOC and Schumer, it's pretty wild.
Oh, well, and, we called for Schumer to step down back in March after the first shutdown fiasco. And I have never experienced a decision that involved such a disjuncture between the reception in Washington around, oh, wow, that's big. That's a huge move. And while being completely uncontroversial outside, we had I think 93% of New York leaders and 97% of leaders around the country. We convened an emergency call of about 1,000 plus folks to talk about it the weekend after, near unanimity. And we got basically no blowback from anyone, because people were really clear that there's no reason to have somebody who is representing the Democratic Party who is simply not capable of doing that on a public stage, has a 17% approval rating, and also was struggling to actually successfully build out strategies and lead the caucus around them.
Waleed, you recently wrote a piece intervening in a strategic debate on the progressive left over whether to prioritize running left-wing primaries against established Democrats in deep blue districts versus trying to flip Republican seats in swing districts. And you make a very persuasive case. I mean, I'm already a partisan of this case, but that it's the left's job, first and foremost, to primary incumbents and take over the party. And of course, it's not that we don't want median Democrats to beat median Republicans, but I think it's pretty clearer than ever since Zohran's victory, that we can build far more power, far more consequentially, affect far deeper kind of fundamental ideological political change in the country by building deep power in the heartland, at the core of the Democratic base. Lay out your argument here and what the state of play in this debate is.
Yeah, I think a metaphor I use for this is like thinking about the Democratic Party as a big ship sailing drifting in the political currents, and swing district Democrats are like the sails. They move with the winds. They have to. If the wind shifts right, they shift right. If the wind shifts left, they nudge left. But the left flank in deep blue districts, they can be an anchoring force. And like whether it's AOC in the Green New Deal or Jamal Bowman in 2020, or even Zohran with affordability, like the number of like Google hits after Zohran wins his primary for affordability just skyrockets. Like it consolidates a term for Democrats to focus on because of his election. There's a way in which these elections in deep blue districts, like centrists and moderates use this term wins above replacement. I think there's meaning, what they mean by that is like, does this Democrat perform better than a generic, like someone like Sherrod Brown? Does this moderate Democrat perform above a generic Democrat in a certain district? I think progressives in blue seats have really big, like the idea of primarying an incumbent and defeating them and then being able to tell a story about them and the platform you won on. That has such a big ideological value in the party for changing what it means to be a Democrat. And so instead of trying to like take on these quixotic adventures in like Montana or even like Idaho, I think we should like consolidate on home turf. We have limited resources. The donor class does not love our candidates, and we're playing way too many away games and burning a ton of resources and energy trying to flip red and purple seats, where I think that we're still a junior partner. We don't have a ton of resources. And I think our real leverage for realigning the party is in electing people where much more of our voters currently are and aren't fully organized into a political vehicle and political force. Like I think about the squad is only, on any given day, like 6 to 8 members of Congress, maybe a little bit more. There's a ton of seats in the country that are similar demographics to the squad's demographics, younger, urban, diverse, that could have like a challenge, a candidate that represents them. Justice Democrats has a candidate in Memphis right now. They have candidates in LA. They have a candidate in Harlem. I think these are the kinds of candidates, if we can build, this is what party building looks like in some ways. If you're in a Trump +3 district, you are going to be forced to moderate on a couple of different issues because of the pressure you're facing from like genuine Republicans and genuine conservatives. And, we still live in a democratic system, more or less, in which you are accountable to your voters. And so you might be a decent vote for Democrats, but, I think about someone like Chris Deluzio or Pat Ryan, who are often held up as kind of the populist kinds of candidates you could have in these purple districts. I think they're great. But they're not like squad members or DSA members or like
Pat Ryan's terrible on Gaza.
Yeah, it's like there's always exceptions to their populism in a way that you can't count on them to be a part of like a coherent political force. That said, like I prefer Pat Ryan and Chris Deluzio to like a generic Democrat. But I think that when you primary Crowley with an AOC or elect a Zohran, you're not just swapping one Democrat for another. You're installing like you're engaging in the politics of realignment.
One thing I'll note to maybe complicate this is there always a neat trade-off between the two. After all, we're speaking on a day when there's a special election in Tennessee, when a very progressive state legislator, Often Ben, is hoping to pull off an upset. I have no idea what the real odds are, but it seems closer than people imagined, against a Republican incumbent.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I mean, Afton's actually a former Indivisible organizer for Tennessee. Has a lot of deep love and support from many.
Leah, on this podcast, you mean to say indivisible cadre member?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is that I think that when you're in a year where there's a wave, everyone should just start swimming. I think that when you're making decisions about kind of where you concentrate resources on a set of strategic plays, you have one set of calculations. For us, it's about, supporting thousands of different groups that are making different decisions in their districts, and then figuring out if there are a few places where we go in collectively in order to support decisions that are happening on the ground. Because fundamentally, a really firm position that we have it for our own folks is it doesn't matter if a national organization has come in with an endorsement unless it's backed up by a genuinely significant level of local grassroots engagement in support of that candidate. So it's hard for us to sort of have a really clear analysis. But what I will say is that, there's the connection that people are making between, wouldn't it be nice if I didn't have to just constantly beg my Democrat to do what's right? And maybe I should look at this challenger is a lot stronger than it has been in the past. I do think my overall frame for folks who are thinking about this strategically is really thinking about that axis of how much of a fighter are you versus how much, where are you on the political spectrum? Because I do think it's a Venn diagram, but it's not a perfect circle. And really making sure that, there's a capturing of the energy around resistance and a marrying of what the politics are with a genuine sense of like, I'm waking up every day thinking about how do I actually get this administration? How do I actually check this administration? I think there are places to go big on that. Again, your orientation around corporate money, orientation around accountability agenda. I think one place where there's often been a little bit of a perceived tension is between, what are you going to do in terms of your economic agenda and how much capital are you prepared to spend on actual actual consequences for the law breaking and the corruption that has happened to date. I think corruption provides a potential nexus, but I do want to encourage folks to really think about, what is the story that I'm telling that involves both materially improving people's lives and also meaningful accountability for the administration to date.
Eric?
I agree with all that. What I'd add is I think there's an additional part of the country which is so deeply red, in which the Democratic brand is so toxic that there is space for more sort of economic populist independent candidates, something like Dan Osborne generally. And I think that is something that we have to, it's an open question. I don't know how far that will go, but I think it's really smart and good to try to make that happen. I don't think it makes sense for DSA or Justice Democrats to endorse someone like Dan Osborne, who certainly doesn't have our position on immigrant rights, for instance, or Palestine. But nevertheless, I think it's a really, really positive development if that type of thing could happen more broadly. And I'd like to see more experimentation. And frankly, I think there would be a role for unions to play in some of these red states to anchor sort of just straightforward economic populist. I would hope that they wouldn't take bad positions on things, but maybe they wouldn't take just any position on some of the hot and button questions we might have different disagreements with. But that does really have a possibility of gaining traction right now. And I think we maybe underestimate the extent to which there is huge divisions and demoralization in the MAGA base that could open big openings in places that we don't currently think of as in play.
Daniel L. from DSA Queens DSA, and I've gotten more into NYC DSA Twitter over the last few months than ever before, so apologies to everyone. He tweeted, quote, "Post Zohran, just like post AOC in 18, because of their wins and the broader political environment, though there will be a tsunami of sufficiently left challengers. DSA failing to cohere and exploit a movements it inspired would be crazy stupid." And so to unpack this a little, I thought it was really interesting and led to a bunch of discussion between various people on the internet. But on the one hand, DSA's approach of only running candidates who are open socialist and, above and beyond that, prioritizing cadre DSA members, that has a lot to recommend. Just look at Zohran. Huge victory, and at the way, generally speaking, NYC DSA has been able to effectively build out their organization as a party-like formation with power and political independence, which is sort of the gold standard for what the socialist left has been trying to do for a decade. But on the other hand, this proliferation of left insurgent campaigns is by necessity larger and broader than DSA and thus beyond its full control. Eric, how can DSA simultaneously stick to its focus and also help lead this broader set of currents? How does DSA help guide this broader front without liquidating its own identity and independence, which has been really important for the revival of left politics in this country?
I think it was a overall huge step forward that after Bernie 2016, DSA started moving towards a new type of left politics electorally, which was different than really what was the dominant trend before then, which was just support any progressive and sort of anything goes. And the reason that that was limited was not just on the politics, although there's part of that, but it just didn't build your organization. It didn't build an independent identity. It didn't build sort of power from below. You couldn't get volunteers to be excited time and time again afterwards. And so New York City DSA in particular, but also elsewhere throughout the country, were right to build like a socialist wing and to develop just a huge amount of volunteer infrastructure out of that. I would flag that it's still quite uneven across the country. There's a lot of DSA chapters that still actually just do kind of progressive endorsements. And so that's part of the tricky thing is it's helpful to try to move away from that in DSA, but it's also the case.
Or the Seattle version where it's much more the other way around. It's much more like fewer endorsements.
Katie Wilson, who is a more than sufficiently left-wing challenger, she's a socialist as far as I can tell, did not get Seattle DSA's endorsement for reasons I don't know about.
Right. That goes actually to what I want to stress here is that I think there's a difficulty in DSA now in how you respond to new terrain where there are genuine left fighters who aren't certainly DSA cadre. Maybe they call themselves socialists or not, but they're not necessarily sharing our politics. And there is a lot of good and hard debates that need to be happening right now to figure out how we relate to someone like a Grant Plattner in Maine. To me, this is just a really good example. I think that, how could you not want to go all in Maine around someone like Grant Plattner? And my response in the internal debates in DSA on this stuff is keep in mind, DSA rose and we're still basically in the Bernie moment, right? Bernie was not a DSA cadre member. Our growth came largely out of and in response to both Trump's election, but then the Bernie moment, which was much bigger than DSA. And I think that there's a possibility and necessity to walk and chew gum at the same time. So what I mean by that is it makes sense for an organization like DSA to primarily focus on running sort of socialist candidates. But particularly when there's high profile, very important battles in which you have essentially like a Bernie-crat running, I do think you need to be more flexible and not just say what's good is happening, and say there's a division of labor, because that's the argument to steelman the case. It's not that people in DSA are against these candidacies, but they say, look, that's great. It's great. Justice Democrats is doing his thing. It's great. Grant Plattner is doing their thing. Hope they win. But we have, our own specific mission that we can, specific value added. The problem with that, I would say, is that it misses the urgency of making sure those candidacies win, right? Like you do need some of the ground game of DSA, I think, in some of these cases to help the Bernie-crats win. And then just more generally, I think of a historic analogy here that has made has helped me clarify what the stakes and dangers are in this moment. The Socialist Party of 100 years ago, of Debs, had basically the DSA dominant approach where you only endorse socialists. And they were successful at it, relatively speaking. But after World War I, there was a massive sort of upsurge in farmer Labor Party and Labor Party movements that weren't directly through the socialist movement. And that was a surprise. They had assumed once workers radicalized, it was all going to come directly to the socialists. But it turned out, actually, they were too small to be the vehicle at that point. So it sort of spilled out much more widely. And the problem was they initially just stuck for years to their orthodoxy. We're only going to support the Socialist Party candidacies. And what ended up happening, and this is my worry, is the best organizers and best unionists and a lot of the best sort of electoral parts of the socialists ended up just jumping ship because they said, if you're not going to create space for me to be both a socialist and part of something bigger, if you're going to make me have to choose, well, I'm going to be part of this thing that's bigger. So I think that is a danger. We want to make sure DSA can be part of something bigger while still maintaining its own distinct identity and organization.
Other thoughts?
I was someone who worked hard to get DSA to endorse Cynthia Nixon and also on the other side, to get Cynthia Nixon to be open to the DSA endorsement. Same with AOC, same with Jamal Bowman, this endorsements go both ways. I just think it's a genuinely difficult problem in the American political system because elected officials in this country are much bigger than any organization or even party. Like we have a uniquely individually driven political system that's, where every elected official ultimately ends up becoming their own small business owner and running their own kind of brand on top of.
We don't have parties per se, as Seth Ackerman's, kind of legendary 2016 Jacobin article, Blueprint for a New Party, argues. The United States does not have normal political parties institutionally, structurally.
And so for an organization like DSA or Justice Democrats or Working Families Party, there's always going to be this tension about the interests of the organization and building the organization versus winning and helping a candidate win. And a candidate who is always going to be bigger than you if you win, and have their own kind of people, staff, whatever. That's an extremely difficult system to operate in. So it's not easy. That said, I think those examples I brought in, like Cynthia Nixon, AOC, Jamal Bowman, they all, I think, helped build DSA, helped build DSA's profile, helped build DSA's engagement with politics. And also you can make a judgment if a candidate is genuinely going to be involved in your coalition or not. But all politicians are self-interested in their own kind of ability to win and do well. But I do think an endorsement and being involved in someone's victory, politicians always remember who were with them when they won, and you are going to be some part of their coalition going forward versus being outside, which is something I always stressed about being involved in races where there's not 100% alignment, but maybe 80 or 90 or 75. That you'd rather there's a way in which you're arguing or persuading a candidate within the tent versus outside the tent that I think is undervalued by people on the endorse fewer and fewer people terrain, or belief. And to go back to our earlier discussion, we are in a moment. I don't think DSA needs to endorse every burning crowd or every challenger. I also think we should keep in mind that these races are getting very, very expensive, and you can't just win with field alone. We undervalue how much public financing mattered in New York for Zohran. Congressional races or non-public financing races in general are just so much harder. Seattle also has public financing. AI, crypto, APAC have all pledged to spend tens, hundreds of millions of dollars on primaries in 2026. A question for me is we have so much demand amongst Democratic voters, amongst Leah's base, amongst DSA, amongst people who want a new just on gerontocracy grounds. There's so much demand that we are for the first time in my political career in Tea Party 2010 territory, but the supply is so limited on the donor side, the candidate side, on the volunteer side, that in 2010 a lot of donors on the conservative side back the challengers, but that's not as true. Obviously David Hogg has built his own email list that is now moving serious money toward people, but it's pennies compared to what APAC and AI and cryptocurrency super PACs are able to generate, which forces groups like DSA and Justice Democrats and WFP to be much more targeted about their approach than maybe the Tea Party was able to do. But that's something I think about is how can we have candidates who can meet the moment, and how can we build infrastructure that can meet the moment in terms of organizing volunteers, organizing donors, and being serious candidates who could potentially even win statewide in their respective states too, and have a future in democratic politics, whether it's a serious squad member or a serious Congressional Progressive Caucus organizer or a potential senator or presidential candidate.
I mean, I think I agree with all of the analysis there. I will just note, I think every cycle there's a conversation about, is this the cycle where kind of the big money on the primaries on the other side starts to backfire? And I feel more hope than I've felt in the past that this is the cycle in which you really, if you see the way in which Democrats are orienting around AIPAC, for example, right now. I think you are seeing the beginnings of that, and hopefully there's an ability to pull that thread through the primaries.
Yeah, I want to actually follow up by finally getting into Palestine politics and AIPAC. But one last thought on this discussion is that I think we perhaps on the socialist left have to simultaneously explore what it means to be kind of flexible and nimble coalition partners across a broader array of insurgent campaigns this cycle, which is in particular, which is shaping up to be a historic cycle, potentially a Tea Party from the left type moment. But at the same time, understanding that someone like Zohran remains the gold standard for the socialist left when we can pull it off, Waleed, precisely because of that dynamic that you point out, that we don't have party structures. And so instead we have what the scholar Paulo Garbaldo calls hyperleaders, which creates this incredibly uneven dynamic between organizations that help a candidate win and that candidate who becomes a center of power and celebrity unto themselves. A huge counterweight there with Zohran is that he is such a deep cadre member of DSA who comes up as a campaign volunteer, regular rank and file organizer in Queens DSA, through being a state assemblyman, through running this campaign, which was truly debated and devised out of the bowels of organized New York City DSA. And but the thing is, we can't do that in every single race in this country. And so holding those two things, which are both true, I think, at the same time is like a fundamental strategic requirement and challenge. So moving on to talk about Palestine politics and about AIPAC and so much more. Last August, Waleed, you and I spent a very intense and weird week in Chicago.
Feels like 10 years
ago. Case. I know. It felt like 10 years being there and 10 years since. So we were there making the case for Palestinian liberation and an end to U.S. support for Israel's genocide in Gaza at the DNC. You were an organizer helping lead the uncommitted movement, and I was an alternate uncommitted delegate from Rhode Island. And we made a moral case, of course, that the Harris campaign must break from Biden and promise for an end to U.S. military aid to Israel on clear moral grounds and also strategic grounds that Harris really risked losing the election if she didn't do the right thing. And we all know what happened. They ignored us, and Harris, of course, lost. Trump became president. And what really drove me nuts after that was how the mainstream media postmortems studiously omitted Gaza as a factor that might explain anything about Harris's loss. Fewer still seemed to recognize that the genocide unfolding with U.S. support played such a key role in laying the groundwork for Trump's authoritarian turn and this general deepening culture of impunity that's defined domestic U.S. politics since Trump returned to office. What role, in your view, has the struggle over Israel and Palestine, over the genocide in Gaza, and also specifically the role of AIPAC in democratic politics, what role has all of that played more generally in the radicalization of the liberal base and even more generally in just this emergent political moment that we've been discussing this entire episode? And how do you account for the refusal on the part of the Democratic establishment and mainstream media to recognize or discuss any of this ever?
I think it's the quote unquote radicalization of voters around Palestine, I think primarily did not happen amongst liberal indivisible base, but happened much more with young people and also non-college educated voters who I'll describe as uncles, aunties, cab drivers, who are basically Palestine becomes a moral X-ray of Democratic Party liberalism, and it showed people what was really there, which was a self-involved, self-interested politics that is all about protecting power versus fighting for you. I keep trying to say to the kind of MSNBC classes, Gaza is part of a story that is also a story about elite condescension to voters who have concerns about Biden's age, cost of living, a number of things that even immigration, there's an idea that like, oh, these problems don't matter. Like the only thing that matters is Donald Trump is on the ballot. We need to defeat him. But like people, that's not how elections work. Like you have to give people a reason to vote for you. And I think that there's been like a real Zohran, I think, explains it best. But I've met so many small business owners, cab drivers who voted for Trump in 2024 for first time they've ever voted for a Republican. And the reason they voted for him was because they felt like the Democrats were pro ethnic cleansing and genocide. And that's certainly true in my family and in my community. You know, with the uncommitted campaign, I was told recently by someone in the Harris orbit that basically every day up until the election, they were considering a pivot on Israel, and they just never did it. And I think the larger story of that is just opposition to risk. Like they were just risk averse and didn't want to do anything that rocked the boat. There was another part of that is they had a real perception that they did not want to appear as too liberal or too left. That explains Liz Cheney. That they also felt like breaking with Biden on Gaza in any way was another signal that they were going left. And I think they just misread the political like moment and arithmetic of the time. You know, I just saw yesterday, like, I think the actor who is the actor who's had the biggest year of like content production in the past like year or two is Pedro Pascal. And Pedro Pascal is headlining and hosting like a benefit concert for Palestine with like some of the biggest like musicians of the past year. And I just don't know how like you could have this like huge influx of like young people, cab drivers, Hollywood, musicians, like in a way that I haven't seen since maybe the Iraq War or even Vietnam, and like pretend that that's just not happening. And I know for a fact that like some of the celebrity influencers around the Harris campaign, of which she had a lot, like were pushing her on this and pushing the campaign on this. And so it wasn't that they didn't know, it was just that they couldn't make a decision, and they couldn't do the courageous thing. I do think that like you know we saw Seth Moulton in Massachusetts, who's running a primary challenge, like not necessarily ideologically against Ed Markey, like say in a way to get left of Markey or in a way to get more populist than Markey. Markey has taken AIPAC donations as far as I'm aware of, and Seth Moulton said he wouldn't. I think that the politics in 2026 and 2028 are going to look radically different than they looked in any preceding presidential election in modern history amongst the like more white liberal college educated New York Times reading class. I think there has been a shift, but the most clear case is a lot of the kind of neighborhoods and demographics that I think Brad Lander helped give a permission structure to older white liberal, Jewish liberal, even liberal Zionist voters to vote for Zohran, even over the concerns of New York Times editorial board on his positions on whatever. Oftentimes his positions are not even named in these stories, but more a vibe. But yeah, I think the future of Democratic Party politics on this issue is gonna look a lot more like Chris Van Hollen and Bernie Sanders and even Rashida Tlaib and AOC than it will look like Joe Biden.
Yeah, Leah, Eric. But first, if you are listening, Ed Markey's aides or friends, you have to pass the torch to Ayanna Pressley. Leah, Eric.
You know, I'll take a couple of steps back on this. You know, so we had just from our own organizational side, we had endorsed Joe Biden in September 2023. In October 2023, we're on the record pretty early for a ceasefire, and you know, by early 2024, calling for cutting foreign assistance and weapons to Israel. You know, that wasn't a position that was without controversy within the movement at the time. And also Israel's actions facilitated a level of consensus around that in pretty short order. Just the sheer level of horror and bloodshed and depravity. You know, by the summer, I think we were in a position, you know, where we had a lot of people who would crawl over broken glass to stop Donald Trump from getting elected, and who were also coming in and saying, you know, I'm on the doors talking to people, and I don't have a good argument here because there's no good argument here because this is just an atrocity. And so I think there was just this genuine disjuncture that began to be like fully expressed following the election, where people were saying, you know, people were not experiencing the loss as Joe Biden is this tragic figure who tried hard. It was this experience of, we have been campaigning and fighting really hard to keep Donald Trump out of office, and also in the process backing a series of horrors, a series of moral horrors. And that was a process and kind of a thing that people have been working through, I think, on the other side. And part of the way that we've seen that manifest is a lot more focus on AIPAC, on the role of kind of the pro-Israel groups in organizing in Democratic primaries. And I think also just a regular series of events where the weaponization of anti-Semitism and the kind of consistent use of Israel adjacent politics is bumping up against the defense of liberal democracy, right? When you look at, the Trump administration's attacks on universities and the ways in which there is a permission structure for that that's being created, not just by AIPAC, but by folks like the ADL and a lot of kind of more mainstream institutions, people are seeing this contradiction and they're trying to work through it in their own organizing. We have a bunch of people who are trying to stop their universities from complying as alumni, who are confronting, the use of kind of shutting down pro-Palestine advocacy as the excuse that is being used in order to shut down academic freedom more broadly. Anyway, so I'll say that I think that there is a convergence around some of these things and kind of a recognition of some overlapping factors. And, I think when we talk about the moment that we're in for the Democratic Party, there's a crisis of confidence. There are only so many things you can do to fix a crisis of confidence while you're out of power, right? It's a sense of Democrats don't actually do the things that they say they want to do. I think one of the things that people understand is that we're facing this crisis of confidence about whether Democrats are actually going to, when they get power, do the things that they want or they say they're going to do. And you can't fix that right now while you're out of power by passing legislation. You have to fix it by behaving differently in tangible ways that you can show the voters you mean business. And so I think you can't understate how significant Zohran's position on Palestine was, not just for folks who are voting specifically on Palestine, but for people who are looking for signifiers that you are anti-establishment and that you're willing to incur credible costs in order to stand for your beliefs.
The only thing I would add is just to underscore how much of a sea change it is in American politics that you can talk in this way about Palestine, that it's not a third rail anymore. There's so much going on in the world that, if anything, we've almost normalized it, but it's just really a watershed. And I think we're only starting to see the beginning of what that's going to look like for American politics. And Zohran was him getting elected was both an expression of that, but then a massive accelerator, because it was just proof of concept that you could win big on a big stage and talk in that way about opposing genocide, about opposing Zionism. That is just, we're in a whole new world. And that's a really important part of global politics now. And, it's the one positive sort of thing I can look to really right now, as far as Israel-Palestine.
One important note in the 2024 story amongst liberals, left, and Muslim Arab organizing is that Uncommitted was trying very hard to demonstrate that you could be anti-genocide and anti-weapons while also being for Democrats to defeat Donald Trump. And that was difficult to hold because there was a disjuncture between liberals who opposed sending weapons to Israel, but supported Democrats defeating Trump. And, this kind of street protest that was pretty ambivalent about whether Democrats defeated Trump to the point of, supporting Jill Stein or even backing Trump.
Or just not voting.
And I think that was a really difficult coalition to hold. I think as Leah was speaking, I was remembering that, obviously there was uncommitted delegates who showed courage and students who showed courage in encampments. But there's also a lot of courage shown by members of the liberal political class, not just Indivisible and Leah herself, but also, Pod Save America hosts, Patrick Gaspard at the Center for American Progress, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is well-read by many liberal rank and file. There was a lot of, outpouring, especially as 2024 dragged on, of liberal organizations, Derek Johnson at the NAACP. People were really amongst the Democratic Party's core constituencies, saying that this was wrong and needed to change. Because the street protests were often so anti-Democrat, anti-Biden, it was very difficult to hold that pro-Democrat coalition together and force something to happen. We tried our best through Uncommitted and Not Another Bomb, but the marriage of pro-Palestine politics being also anti-Democratic Party politics yeah, just made it harder to hold that coalition to get a concession from Harris.
I mean, just speaking as the, from my vantage point as someone who at that moment was calling through the people we could get a phone number for on the on the Harris campaign and saying, what are you doing? Please give them a speaking slot. I really think that kind of lack of trust was so fundamental. There was just like a lack of recognition of the genuinely strategic intervention that you all were trying to execute at the time, and like a lack of understanding that it was intended to help them to articulate a position that would pull more people along with them rather than kind of an extension of kind of just a criticism.
Right, because there was frankly no way for people in the uncommitted movement to make a plausible case to the millions of Americans horrified by Biden's enthusiastic, really perverse support for Israel's genocide in Gaza, to make a case to those people that it was worth voting for Harris without a policy shift. And so I just like one thing I want to underline here is that I find the mass alienation from Biden, the Biden-Harris ticket, if not maybe in the cold light of day retrospectively strategic, I have profound empathy for people who couldn't bring themselves to vote for her.
And going back to the conversation about how we're orienting around Trump voters this time around, this is an important factor, right? Like you still see people on the internet very ghoulishly rejoicing in escalations of deportations around Dearborn, Michigan. And it's just like strategically and morally profoundly offensive and counterproductive.
Yeah, and similar kind of sicko glee around intensifications of violence in Gaza. Oh, are you happy he's president now? Following up on some points that Waleed made earlier, I want to ask, why is the Democratic establishment the way that it is? Why do they and their favored media mouthpieces so stubbornly cling to convention, even as conditions become so clearly entirely unconventional? Why are they so resolutely in denial of or hostile to their base? Why do they insist on concepts like popularism when they just mean moderation and triangulation, the same thing we've seen dominate the Democratic Party politics since the Clinton administration, a politics whose track record includes, you write, Waleed, quote, the Iraq War, curbs on abortion access, opposition to marriage equality and Dreamers, more oil and gas drilling, a moral panic over an Islamic center in Lower Manhattan, the slow strangling of the public option. Why does everything feel simultaneously stage managed and soulless and also directionless and defeated? I know this is a broad question, but it seems like an important one that we've been constantly touching on pretty much with every answer so far. But what is it that makes the Democratic establishment and their media cheerleaders such losers in the particularly pathological way that they are? It's just breathtaking, constantly.
I was recently on a panel with someone from the Welcome PAC, which is one of these PACs who are political outfits that are attempting to elect quote unquote heterodox Democrats. So what they mean by heterodox is, I mean, I don't know if they mean it this way, but
Anti-trans.
what I've seen, what I've seen them produce is often pro-life Democrats, anti-choice Democrats, pro-fossil fuel Democrats, people who like a little bit more right-wing on immigration, not there on trans rights, and like, et cetera, et cetera. And the moderator asked me and this other person, do either of you feel welcome in the Democratic Party? And both of us said no. And then she asked, well, who is the Democratic Party for then? And I think it was interesting, like that, someone who quote unquote identifies as a heterodox Democrat, or what we might call like centrist Democrat, and me, it was a challenging question where I'm like, I think that who the Democratic Party is for is like embodied in the politics of the leadership of the party, which is like, how do you create the like math equations that will get you to 50%? And like, how do I manage all this stuff rather than like, how do I manage the coalition in a way and manage the groups and manage the message in such a polished way so that it like adds up to 50% rather than like just being person in the world and a leader in the world and like trying to mold a consensus. And I think that it reminds me, not to bring it back to my amateur historian ways, but it reminds me of the Whig Party in the 19th century, where it's like, doesn't really add, like the politics of the leadership and the politics of the establishment class is vote for me because what else are you going to do? And it doesn't like add up to like a political vision, political horizon, like core convictions. And in a world in which we're dominated by like screens on our cell phone that demand authenticity and we're like filled with AI slop, and like there's a way in which the like even the formation of like selfie videos, and you are having to viscerally engage with voters, like these people are not up to the task in a moment that demands like just like honesty and like conviction. And like even I was watching Claudia, in Mexico, they have like a ceremony called, like, I forget what it's called. Maybe one of you know, but it's called the Grita.
Grito de Dolores.
Yeah, and so Grito de Dolores, where like the president of Mexico has to do this like guttural kind of shout that is like reminds people of like Mexican heritage, Mexican fighting. And I'm like talking to someone, and I was like, is there any American politician who could like authentically do something? Obviously, it's a different culture, but like the just the ability to like
Howard Dean.
produce yeah, Howard Dean. The ability to produce something that comes from your gut just is not something that like when you're tasked with managing the donor class and managing like you're just management, and like it comes across that way. I don't know. I don't know what other people think.
Yeah, Leah, Eric?
I would just add that I think Trump winning is not an existential threat to them, but the sort of left anti-insurgents taking over the Democratic Party is an existential threat to that establishment class. And that explains, I think, a lot of their behavior, because the reality is if we can both defeat Trump and do that in a way that is closer to a Bernie politics than to what, 50 years of neoliberalism is, that will both take them out of their jobs. A lot of them will just lose their jobs. But also just on a personal level, I think, prove them wrong in a way that if you've been committed for decades of saying that the way you win is pivoting to the center, to have it be shown to be not only wrong, but in some ways abetting the far right wing that you say. And I think they probably in many ways are, genuinely committed to fighting. That is just puts into question your whole legacy and what you've been doing with your life. And so there's a reason then that the Democratic establishment fought so hard against Zohran, right? How can you explain this just intense fight? And some of them eventually kind of walked it back, but it poses a real threat to them. And I think they understand that.
I struggle with this question. I mean, I think, longest thread in history locked by moderators at 8,000 pages or whatever. But, I think there's certainly an extraordinary tenacity in the ways that they fight against leftist insurgents. And I also, when you talk about who's a threat to who, it continues to shock and confuse me that right-wing coup protesters, whatever you want to call them, January 6ers, tried to literally kill everybody in Congress 6 years ago. And that doesn't seem, and Donald Trump continues and his lackeys continue to indict and go after and terrorize and incite stochastic violence against the entire kind of Democratic leadership and Democratic electeds. And there's still not a kind of clear consolidated behavior that suggests that they, experience that as a genuine and immediate personal threat. And so I feel like you have to kind of reach for some set of deeper explanations. I think it's clear, like there's a coherency to the MAGA political project that allows people to be pretty clear about what are good outcomes, what are bad outcomes, what are we all rowing towards, that there's not towards the Democratic Party, which is inherently kind of a coalition of a lot of different, a different set of different stakeholders, and it doesn't have a clear orientation around corporate power that would allow it to automatically and clearly make decisions about how do you exercise and how do you behave. And I do think there's a set of folks beyond the electeds that are about, an establishment infrastructure and a way of doing business and a way of advancing your own career that make things sticky and hard to change with, just a project of specific electeds. And also elections are what we have. I mean, I guess my a top line takeaway that will always drive me crazy is that, we spent an extraordinary amount of time talking about how do you win back the working class over the last year. And the sheer number of times that conversation was reduced to the positions you take versus like, maybe it's a problem that the vast majority of Democratic electeds are lawyers with degrees from Ivy League institutions, are, business owners, are not themselves in any meaningful way credible representatives of the working class. The fact that was often not even part of the conversation, to me, suggests some of the deeper problems.
It's also worth saying, though, that there have been some cracks. So that there's a bit of a sort of weird dynamic where people who were from the establishment have moved closer to us. And so now we don't consider them part of the establishment. But it's just
like Van Hollen.
Yeah, Van Hollen, even like Chris Murphy. Yeah. And so there's an extent to which maybe we underestimate the extent to which we're already having an impact and cracking that a little bit. And it's just worth saying that the best example we have this in US history is FDR. FDR really was the establishment, but under a lot of mass pressure from below, essentially broke from the old establishment. And I do think there's a world in which you could see something similar today, in which it doesn't mean that we necessarily take over the party, but we're pulling it towards a more working class, more militant stand, and you're going to see cracks above. And we should be ready to understand those fissures and not to assume that it's necessarily just a cynical ploy. There might be real fissures that open up possibilities for moving forward.
To close out, Eric, you wrote earlier this year that while the anti-oligarchy tour had been, quote, essential, Bernie and AOC could take an additional step. Ask all rally attendees to become organizers. The fate of our country depends in part on channeling the excitement of these events into an escalating, mass-based campaign. High-attention moments like big rallies can be used to directly onboard everyday people looking to fight back. General appeals to get involved locally aren't enough. People need specifics and next steps. I feel like this really points to a level of concrete strategic planning, infrastructure, capacity building, where the broad left, the socialist left, left liberals, this broader thing that we're talking about and instantiating through this discussion, I feel like this is an area where we are rather weak. My assessment is that we don't have a national strategy because we don't have a clear shared analysis to plan how to resource and nurture a real national infrastructure that meets the moment. And I think really telling examples of this are that look to two giant consequential election victories, NYC DSA winning Zohran and Justice Democrats electing AOC with NYC DSA's help. These were both accomplished by grassroots bootstrapping operations with little coordinated support from far better resourced entities at the national level. Or we could look at interesting things going on in organizing right now, like my friends at the Connecticut Tenants Union. Also, grassroots bootstrapping operations that I think are going to receive more high-level support now that they've proven success. But there's certainly no national infrastructure in place to see something like Connecticut Tenants Union in its early phases of formation and help nurture it to a place of growth and success. You have to bootstrap your way to growth and success, and then maybe you'll earn that support. What would it mean for our most high-profile electeds to work with our most powerful organizations and unions? We haven't talked enough about labor in this discussion. We'll have to save that for another interview. To resource and build out the strategy, infrastructure, capacity that we need for this moment in a coherent and powerful way.
So it's not Bernie and AOC's fault that we don't have this broader infrastructure. I think that, or even a broader campaign, I think that if we build it, they will come. But there is a real disconnect between the fact that our side's biggest platforms, Bernie and AOC and now Zohran, particularly Bernie and AOC, we don't yet have a mechanism for all the people who are excited about them and go to these rallies to plug in. And there's a real challenge there that we need to figure out how to overcome. And I would say that this is part of just the broader challenge of how we meet this moment and how we bring in the most of Americans and most of the people we need on our side are not yet organized. They're not yet part of our groups. I think the answer is primarily about building scalable campaigns. I don't think it's like a new organization. I don't think we need like yet another coalition. What we need is one or two really big fights that everybody can get on board in. And just to give two examples of what that could look like, One is just, for instance, on a state level in New York, it would be really amazing if there's a fighting oligarchy tour, a Bernie AOC, that can plug people into the push to tax the rich to fund Zohran's agenda. Like, especially in upstate New York, that'd be really, really important because we need more pressure on Hochul and the Democratic establishment. And you can have those rallies, but then immediately plug people into there's a new organization, Our Time, and DSA has a Tax the Rich campaign. Plug them in, get them organizing their neighborhoods, their coworkers to fight for that agenda. And then the second piece is on just how do we stop authoritarianism? And to put it as quickly as possible, the experience of other countries and of strategists is you really need to focus on pulling away the pillars of support for the administration, because that's where you actually have most leverage in between elections. And so that means, in particular for us, a focus on pulling away the companies that have bent the knee to Trump. And I think that there's huge space for all of the reasons we've talked about to make a real scalable national campaign around that, in which you call out the ways that the Amazons of the world and all these other companies are actively abetting ICE, actively giving money to the Trump administration. But then we have an escalating campaign. And I think this is different than what is currently happening, which there's a lot of quite broad online calls for boycotts, but without the kind of energy and momentum and action escalation that you would need to make these boycotts real. So I would imagine concretely what Bernie AOC could plug people into is if there becomes a coalition, imagine Indivisible plus some of the SEIU and other unions and No Kings, push to have an escalating campaign, for instance, building up towards next May Day, in which we're calling out the corporate elite for their actions towards Trump, and we're calling on them to break and to take action. And you start by doing, employees could have petitions, consumers have petitions, you do press conference and rallies, but you build up to, for instance, like first days of action, which workers could stick out, and which consumers do a one-day boycott, which is actually much more effective because you can measure it and you can see what the impact is happening rather than just sort of a kind of amorphous general boycott. And the reason I think it's so important to build up for this type of nonviolent disruptive action is that there's a very high chance that we win the election in 2026 and 2028, but that the Trump administration will try to use anti-democratic mechanisms to stay in power. And unless we start building up our muscle memory for how you do mass nonviolent civil disobedience and protests beyond just one-day rallies, then we're not going to be able necessarily to meet that moment and push back against authoritarianism. So we need to start getting people into the orientation of how do we force the other parts of the elite to break with Trump? How do we get the companies to say no? How do we get all of these other institutional actors that ultimately we're going to have to be pressuring when Trump tries to stay in power? We need them to call the question and say, no, for the sake of the system, we're pushing you out. And that is going to come down to the amount of mass nonviolent protests we had before. And just the last thing I would say on that, one of the huge difficulties we have is that the left and the union movement is very siloed. People are working in a million different turfs, and we're not used to actually doing something bigger than ourselves and putting our sort of individual organizational routines and inertia away. And that, I think, is the challenge we have, is the left to pick a big fight and do it all together.
Yeah, I think, rallies are really helpful to capture a moment in time and to show how much of an organic base is behind something. It's a good earned media moment. I think they helped inject oligarchy into the frame of national discourse about the Democratic Party. But rallies can be even more effective when they get institutionalized into some sort of organized force. I also think about how, like, in 2016 and 2020, Bernie had the largest rallies of any candidate, but still was defeated by Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, who had much smaller rallies than him. And I think about the challenge of what that demonstrates toward the left about being more effective institution builders, being more effective organizers. Daniel Schlossman and Sam Rosenfeld have this essay called The Long New Right that largely focuses on Jesse Helms created something called, who is a conservative senator, created something called the National Congressional Club that was basically like a political machine that organized donors and grassroots conservative activists into becoming basically candidate pipelines for candidates. It scared moderates in the Republican Party. It helped control primaries, and it like defined the rightward turn of the Republican Party, because Jesse Helms created this thing. Bernie and AOC like have versions of that through their individual like PACs and whatever. But I think there is like the infrastructure of both themselves as campaigners and the anti-oligarchy tour. If Bernie, Warren, and AOC combine their resources and relationships into something, it would be like a juggernaut that could really help Justice Democrats, DSA, in like a much bigger way than anything we currently have. And at the same time, the individuals who are attending those rallies or who support them, most of the vast majority of people who like Bernie and AOC are not members of DSA, probably are not involved in Justice Democrats, but like could be if they're like the because of the celebrity individual driven politics we have, could be like driven to something more permanent and coherent. But we have a history in this country where politicians are not exactly great organization builders. You look at Jesse Jackson or Howard Dean or Obama or even Bernie in Our Revolution. I think there's a lot lacking there. So some of this has to be a marriage from organizers and elected officials. I think More Perfect Union has done a good job of trying to get Bernie to like participate in something that is like really effective and impactful. But I would like us to build more institutions and machines than just rallies.
Leah.
I can't underscore Eric's point about the forthcoming attempt to steal the election strongly enough. This is not a regime that intends to be chastened by the voters via a normal democratic process and then allow a Democratic House or Senate to take office. Whether they are in the position to meaningfully stop that depends a lot on kind of what kind of political capital that they have heading in. But I also would add, I don't think it's like there will be one single moment. I think there's going to be an ongoing campaign of election subversion over the course of this year that is designed to shape and rig the circumstances in which the election takes place, and then potentially, if the outcome is not in their favor, a series of legal challenges attempting to overturn the results they don't like. And so I absolutely agree with the basic assessment that if all we're capable of as of that point is a really big one-day protest, that is not going to be sufficient to meaningfully counteract a determined push to steal an election. And so I think there has to be a lot of intentional work in the meantime around, the basic work of absorption, not in the sense of like putting people on an email list, but in the sense of actually really intentionally crafting plans and developing the preparation in advance such that when folks come to the next No Kings, there's a really clear, here's where you're going the next week. That is an in-person training, that is an in-person meeting from an organization that's capable of meaningfully onboarding people. That might look different in different places, but one of the advantages and one of the things that we hope with a little bit longer lead time before we do another one is to really build that out, because I think we've been able to do some of it organically. We often have new indivisible groups form because somebody had their first rally in history in a small town in Montana, and that group started to have the rally, but now it's continuing on to be involved in local politics, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a lot of work to be done in terms of how does that become a holistic cross-movement effort that really bridges some of these sectoral divides. And the one other thing I'd add on that is that I really do think an undersung story is the role of labor unions in No Kings. AFT was absolutely crucial in getting the first No Kings off the ground. SEIU has been heavily involved. I think that is a place to continue to build as we, deepen and build the coalition for the future. But I really do think that one of the untold stories of the last year has been the extent to which the severity of the threat has really fostered a truly unprecedented level of egoless and cross-sector willingness to collaborate on big picture efforts.
Well, Eric Blanc, Leah Greenberg, and Waleed Shahid, thank you all very, very much.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That was Eric Blanc, Leah Greenberg, and Waleed Shahid. Eric Blanc is a labor and NYC DSA activist, a professor of labor studies at Rutgers University, and the author of the recent book, We Are the Union. He writes at the Substack laborpolitics.com. check out an interview with Eric on his book, We Are the Union, in the Dig's vast archives. Leah Greenberg is a co-founder and co-executive director of Indivisible, where she supports a grassroots movement of thousands of local Indivisible groups across the country. Before co-founding Indivisible, she worked as a staffer for Congressman Tom Perriello and at the State Department. Waleed Shahid is executive director of The Block and a political strategist who advised campaigns like Uncommitted and the Green New Deal. A former spokesperson for Justice Democrats, he's worked with candidacies of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jamal Bowman, and Summer Lee, and serves on the editorial board of The Nation. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that true democracy will transform the haughtiest masters of the people into its always removable servants, a mock responsibility by a real responsibility as they act continuously under public supervision. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram and Blue Sky at The Dig Radio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, please rate and review us. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you telling your friends about the pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.